In 1972 and 1973, a series of murders shocked Northern California. College girls began to disappear while hitchhiking. Two of the victims were picked up from the campus of the University of California at Santa Cruz. That's where Ed Kemper's mother was working as an administrative assistant.
Hey friends, welcome to my channel. M. Nelson here, and if you like everything creepy from horror stories and movies to true crime, this is the place for you. That's all we're going to talk about here. And the first one that we're going to talk about, everybody has that serial killer that just kind of sticks with them, that kind of got them interested in the subject in the first place. Some people it's Ted Bundy, some people it's Charlie Manson, some people it's Jeffrey Dahmer. And for me, mine's Ed Kemper, Big Ed Kemper. And I think the reason why he fascinates me so much, and you'll see when we talk about him, is because how messed up it was and how it could have been prevented so many different times, and just how lucky he was. Ed Kemper was born on December 18th of 1948, and he is a third. So that might get a little confusing. His dad was Edmund Kemper Jr., and his grandpa was Edmund Kemper Sr., so he was the third Ed Kemper. And his mom was Clarnell Elizabeth Kemper. They had a horrible relationship. His dad used to be a World War II vet, and when he came back home, he started working as an electrician. And his mom, Clarnell, didn't really appreciate that line of work, didn't really appreciate what he did. In fact, Edmund Jr., who was Ed Kemper's father, hated living with Clarnell. The two of them didn't get along, and they ended up separating. And they separated in 1957. And that was really hard on Edmund. Edmund was a lot closer to his dad. Edmund did not care for his mom. Like I said, he really hated her. And within good reason, she was not very kind to him, especially after her and Edmund Jr. separated. Edmund III, or Ed, who we're talking about today, ended up moving and living with his mom in Helena, Montana, which they had moved from California to Montana, and he had moved away from his dad. And like I said, that made him miserable. He hated living with his mom. And a big part of the reason, like I said, I don't fault him for that. She was really kind of demeaning to Edmund. She would tell him all the time that he reminded her of his dad. She would make him sleep in the basement, and she would lock him in the basement to prevent him from hurting his two sisters. He had an older sister and a younger sister. So every night she would lock him away from the rest of the family. She would make fun of him for his size. If you look at the pictures, and we'll show a couple pictures of Ed, he was a very, very large man. He was born 13 pounds. By the time he was 15 years old, he was over 6 foot at 15 years old. He was always a big guy. Notably tall, very notably tall. He would later describe her as being, a sick and angry woman. And like I said, he genuinely hated the woman. He did not care for her at all. He had a dark childhood. You hear about serial killers having markers for being a serial killer, and Ed definitely hit some of those markers. On the lighter end of things, he would take his sister's dolls' heads and pop their heads off. On the darker side of the spectrum, he used to like to play a game with his sisters where he would pretend to be executed, and have his sisters flip the switch where he would pretend to be electrocuted in the electric chair, and he would, act out the act of being electrocuted, or he would pretend to be executed by gas chamber, and he would act out the act of dying from gas. Darker even still, you hear serial killers, they torture animals and they kill animals, and Ed certainly did that. Several of the family cats were lost to Edmund and his tendencies. One of them he buried alive, and after a few days, and when it was good and dead, he dug it up and decapitated it. Another family cat, he killed it, and he actually kept parts of the cat, like the deconstructed body of the cat. He kept it in his closet for several days, and then his mom found it and threw it out. One time when he was in the 2nd grade, he took his dad, remember his dad was a former World War II vet. He took his dad's bayonet and went and sat outside of his 2nd grade teacher's house and just kind of watched her through the windows while holding on to his dad's bayonet. In 2nd grade, like, I just don't get that. He was obviously messed up. When he was 14 years old, he was tired of living with his mom, and so he took matters into his own hands, and he decided he was going to find his dad and try to move in with his dad. And so he did. He took off, and he ended up finding his dad. And he stayed there for a little bit of time. He stayed with his dad. When he found his dad, I guess he hadn't seen or heard from him in a while. He was surprised because not only had his dad remarried, but his dad also had another child. Ed had a stepbrother he knew nothing about. But yeah, so he stayed with his dad for a little bit, and then it just got to be too much. And so rather than sending him back to live with his mom, Clarnell, he sent him to live with Ed Sr. and his wife Maud, Edmund Jr.'s parents, his paternal grandparents. And at this time, that's when things would go from like a dark childhood to a very dark childhood. When he was 15 years old and he was living with his grandparents, that's when he would commit not only his first murder, but it was a double homicide against his grandparents. The reason why that happened, he hated living there, for one. It was almost as bad as living with his mom. His grandma Maud was very similar to his mom. He would say in later interviews that they were both very strong-willed, matriarchal kind of women who kind of put him down, kind of demeaned him, and made him feel little. So she was very reminiscent kind of the relationship that he had with his mom. And he respected his grandpa, but his grandpa was old and senile, and he didn't enjoy living there. One day, on August 27th of 1964, his grandpa went out to go get groceries, and Edmund and his grandma Maud were sitting at the dining room table, the kitchen table, and they got into an argument. And so Edmund got up from the table and he left. And when he came back, he had his rifle. Now, this was a rifle that had been given to him for the purposes of hunting, but it was confiscated from him because it said he was killing animals, like shooting birds in the yard, which wasn't really the point of the gun. The point of the gun was to take hunting and not like just kill yard birds. So they'd confiscated it from him, but I guess he got it back. And they got into a fight at the table. And so he brought it in there, and his grandma looked at him, Maud looked at him and said, "What, are you going to be going and shooting birds again?" Pretty much. And at 15 years old, Edmund responded by shooting her once in the back of the head and twice in the back, killing her. Sometime later, when his grandfather pulled into the driveway, Edmund went outside, met his grandpa in the driveway next to his truck, and shot and killed him. Edmund then called his mom and said, "Hey, I just killed Grandma and Grandpa. What do I do?" And she said, "Well, you call the police." And so he did. I mean, he did. And he was arrested. And when he was asked about it, he said he shot his grandma because he wanted to know what it felt like to shoot grandma. And when they asked why he shot his grandpa, he said, well, he didn't want his grandpa to know what it felt like to have a dead wife. Like, he didn't want his grandpa to go through the pain of losing his wife. So I guess he just put him out of his misery. We'll consider it. So he was arrested, and they decided that he was 15 years old, and they decided that the crimes he committed were incomprehensible for someone that young. And so rather than sending him to prison, they sent him to a state hospital, like a mental state hospital. And during the proceedings, they diagnosed him as being a paranoid schizophrenic. Now, when he made it to the state hospital, the psychiatrist there did not think he was a paranoid schizophrenic. They said, yeah, he had a personality trait disturbance, and it was a passive-aggressive personality trait disturbance, but they didn't think it was schizophrenia. When he was at the hospital, he was a model prisoner. He was very well behaved, very kind. Everybody liked him. He did so well. In fact, the psychiatrist there liked him so much that he was often put in charge of administering psychiatric tests to the other inmates. While he was there, he had his IQ tested twice. The first time it was 136, and the second time it was 145. Very smart, genius level young man. And so, like I said, he did, for lack of a better word, he did really well when he was locked up, when he was in the hospital, the state facility. Now, given his intelligence, given the relationship that he had with the psychiatrists and the other inmates, given his knowledge of the tests that he was administering on behalf of the psychiatrists, he was smart enough and manipulative enough that he was able to manipulate the system, and he knew all the right answers. He knew what they were wanting to hear. And he was able to convince his psychiatrists that he was rehabilitated, that he was fine. He killed 2 people, but he was fine. Like, everything was all good now. He was fixed. He was released from prison after 6 years on his 21st birthday. His records were not immediately expunged. He went on probation. His probation psychiatrist said, if I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would think that we were dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illnesses. It is in my opinion that he has made very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or any member of society. Since it may allow him more freedom as an adult to develop his potential, I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records. Wow. So that's what he got. Edmund got his records expunged, and they just let him live his life. I mean, like I said, this is the first case that stuck with me because you'll see, holy moly, the amount of things in this case that could have prevented things from happening. Like, this was just strike number 1, but okay, murder 2 people, get out in 6 years, and not only get out in 6 years, have a little bit of time on probation, and then completely record expunged. You want to know how crazy it was? Edmund applied to be a police officer during his probationary period. And while he applied for being a police officer, do you know what kept him from being a police officer? It was not the fact that he killed 2 people. It was not the fact that he killed his grandma because he wanted to know what it felt like to shoot grandma. No. The thing that kept Edmund from being a police officer, and I've never even heard such a thing, but he was too tall. He was too tall to be a police officer, and that was the thing that kept him from being a police officer. His height, his stature. He was 6'9" at the time that he applied, and he was well over 200 pounds. He's a very big, very large man. But that's what kept him from being a police officer. Not the murder, his height. That didn't stop him from being friends with the police officers. He considered himself to be kind of a nuisance to the police officers in the Santa Cruz area because now he was living in Santa Cruz. He had been released from prison back to his mother's care, which the psychiatrists at the time of his release did not think that was a good idea. His mom was obviously a point of pretty intense tension with Ed. The relationship was not a good and healthy one. The psychiatrist did not think he should live with her, but he was released to her to live in Santa Cruz in her home, and that's where he lived during his probation period and then a little while after that. While he was on probation, he would go to the jury room, which was a local bar. It was kind of a local police hangout. He got the nickname of Big Ed while he was there. He'd buy police officers drinks. They'd buy him drinks. Like I said, he was a very common fly on the wall around the police. Like I mean, they weren't best friends and going out on the weekends, but he saw them at the bar all the time. He'd chat with them at the bar all the time. He was always there. He was there frequently. He was a common face. Everybody who knew him said he was a very likable person, said he was a kind person. Big Ed, he was Big Ed. That was his nickname when he would go to the bar. Since he didn't become a police officer, he would work a bunch of menial jobs, and one of these jobs was working the highway division, and he was able to save up enough money to move out of his mom's house and in with a friend, but this was really short-lived. He had a lot of financial trouble, and he had to move back in with her not long after. But one day he was hit by a car while he was on his motorcycle, and his arm was severely injured during this, and he actually got a settlement check for $15,000. Now, that to me, that sounds like a good chunk of change, but with inflation in today's economy, $15,000 then would have been over $90,000 now. It was a significant amount of money. So he used part of this money to buy a vehicle, to buy a car, and to move out of his mom's house. And unfortunately, it would lead to him starting his hobby of picking up women, raping them, and killing them. I mean, that's essentially what it is. The car was the vehicle that allowed him to do the things that he did, and it all started with him being able to afford that car and be able to have that car. When it started with just picking up hitchhikers and dropping them off where they needed to be. Edmund said in later interviews he thinks he probably picked up 150 or so female hitchhikers and did just that. He picked them up and then he took them where they wanted to be. After that, he was not able to control his homicidal and sexual urges. He called them his little zapples, and when he would get them, he felt compelled to act on them. And that would result in the death of 8 women, and it would culminate with the murder of his mother and his mother's best friend. But it would start on May 7th, 1972. And it would start with 2. And those 2 were 18-year-old hitchhikers Mary Ann Pesk and her good friend Anita Mary Luchessa. And he picked them up with their intentions of catching a ride to Stanford University. Instead, he drove them to a secluded and wooded area, and he handcuffed Pesk. He put Luchessa in the trunk of his car. He strangled and stabbed Pesk to death. He did the same thing to her friend Luchessa after. When he finished, this is the part where I tell you so many factors could have stopped this, like nipped it in the bud so quick. When he finished with this first murder, he put them in the trunk of his car and went to take them home to his apartment, and he was pulled over for a broken taillight. He was pulled over and obviously just told, hey, fix your taillight, with 2 dead women in his trunk. And yeah, just fix your taillight and go on your way. And so he did. He took them back to his apartment. He took pictures of them, had intercourse with their corpses. He cut their heads off, decapitated them. He dismembered them. He kept the head for the purposes of using their mouths for exactly what you think. After he got rid of the bodies, the only remnants ever found was one skull, one of the 2 girls' skull. They found no other remains. His youngest victim was next. Aiko Ku was 15 years old when she missed the bus to her dance class. And so he picked her up and took her to a secluded spot and held her at gunpoint. And remember me saying he was such a likable guy? Well, after he held her by gunpoint and took her to a secluded spot, he ended up locking himself out of the car with her inside the car. And you want to tell me that Ted Bundy was convincing and Ted Bundy was smooth, and Ed convinced her to let him back in the car. After he held her at gunpoint and took her to a secluded area, he still was able to get her to let him back in the car. And when he did, he strangled her until she passed out. He raped her. He killed her. He put her in the trunk of his car. And instead of driving home, he drove to the bar to have a few drinks. He later said afterwards, he left the bar and looked into the trunk and admired it like a fisherman admiring his catch of the day. He took her home. He had sex with her body and then dismembered her and got rid of her as well. Between her and the next victim, Ed had to move back in with his mom. This didn't stop him. He continued his spree. And the next person that he took was Cindy, Cynthia Ann Shull. And he picked her up on January 7th of 1973. He drove her to a secluded and wooded area. He shot her and he put her body in the trunk. He brought her back to his mother's house, unloaded her, kept her in the closet, and waited until his mom went to work the next day. When his mom went to work the next day, he took her out of the closet. He did what Ed does, what we've learned that he does. When he was done getting his fix, he took her body to the bathtub where he dismembered her and cut off her head. He got rid of the body parts, but kept the head for a while for what Ed keeps heads for. And when he was done with that, after a few days, he buried her head in his mother's garden. And he said that he buried it in her garden, looking up at his mother's room, because his mother always wanted people to look up to her. Now, by this point, 4 women have been picked up hitchhiking and murdered. And so there was talk about how there was a fear that there might be a serial killer targeting co-ed students, the co-ed killer, as he was later known to be. And so the police and the campus was sending out warnings. Hey, don't get in cars with people you don't know. If you're trying to get a ride throughout the university, make sure you know the person, or make sure they are a member of staff, somebody that works for the school. You'll know they work for the school because they will have a sticker on their vehicle showing that they are a member of staff. Ed's mom worked at the school. Ed was able to get a sticker for his car that made it look like he was somebody to be trusted. That's part of the reason why on February 5th of that year, Rosalind Heather Thorpe and Alice Helen Lou, or Allison, got into his car. They were a little hesitant at first, but they convinced each other because he seemed trustworthy. When they got in the car, he fatally shot both of them. He brought their bodies back to the home. Only before taking them in, he decapitated them in the car and brought their lifeless, headless bodies inside to do what Ed does. And he had sex with their bodies. And then he dismembered them the next day and got rid of their bodies. Things finally ended on April 20th of that year, 1973. And they ended because Ed decided to finally go after the one woman that he had been meaning to go after this whole time. His mom, Clarnell. The woman who he owed all his rage and all his anger and resentment and mental unwellness to. Ed waited for her to fall asleep. And when she fell asleep, he took a claw hammer into her bedroom and bludgeoned her. After he had hit her about the head several times, he took a penknife and slit her throat. After that, he decapitated her. He ripped out her vocal cords and like her larynx and her tongue. He tried to shove it down the garbage disposal to get rid of it, but it just kind of backed up and lured into the sink. He violated her head, just like he does. He put her head on a shelf and screamed at it. He used it as a dartboard. After that, he had put her in the closet and he wanted to set up an alibi to make it look like she went on vacation with her best friend. So he called her best friend and invited her over for dinner and a movie or whatever. He just wanted to get her over to the house. Of course, he did all this after he left and went to the bar to have a few drinks because alcoholism, of course, runs in the family. His mother was an alcoholic, and it seems like Ed was at the bar every other weekend. I don't know if he's an alcoholic, but he seems to be at the bar a lot. I don't know. Just from my research, it seems like he was always going to the bar. But he called her over for a dinner and a movie, and when she arrived, after he went to the bar for a few drinks, when she arrived, he strangled her to death, and he put her in the closet with his mom. And he wrote a note to the police to leave at his mom's house, and the note read, approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents. Just a lack of time. I've got things to do. And he left that note. He left his home that he shared with his mother in Santa Cruz. And he loaded his car with several hundred rounds of ammunition. He had 3 guns with him at the time. He got caffeine pills, so that way he wouldn't sleep. He popped a couple caffeine pills nonstop, and he drove consistently without breaking from California to Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado. And he thought that he was being hunted. He just thought for sure that they were going to be behind him. That's why he took the caffeine pills and why he didn't stop. When he got there, he immediately checks the news to see what they're saying about his mother's death. And he was pretty surprised to see that there was nothing about the news. There are so many things where this could have just gone another way. Like, I swear, Ed Kemper, he was the luckiest man in the world because there was nothing on the news. And so he called the police station and he told the police, hey, I killed my mom and her best friend. And the police thought he was messing around and they hung up on him. And so a few hours later, he called the police station again and he actually asked to speak to one of the police officers he knew by name because remember, he was always at the bar and he was always drinking with him. And so he called and asked for one of them by name, and he told them, "Hey, I killed my mom and her friend." And so then at that point, he was taken into custody. And when he was in custody, he admitted to the other 6 women that he had killed. When they asked, when they asked why he was turning himself in, he said that the original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. Toward the end there, I just started feeling the folly of the whole damn thing, and at the point of near exhaustion, near collapse, I just said to hell with it and called it all off. This gives credit to the his mom being the ultimate goal here, and people suspecting that the women were surrogates for his mother, because once he was able to accomplish that, and once he was able to take out the woman that he had wanted to take out this whole time, there was nothing else for him. He had no other interest. He had nothing. So, on May 7th, 1973, he was officially indicted on all 8 murders. And because of the evidence against him, he admitted to the whole thing, his counsel decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. They couldn't plead not guilty and try to act like he didn't do it because he said, "I did it." 3 separate court-appointed psychiatrists all agreed that he was legally sane enough to stand trial, and so he did. He took the stand himself, and he tried to convince the jury that he was insane, and part of the way he did this was, well, one, he said, nobody in their right mind would do what I did, which, he's not wrong. Nobody in their right mind would do that, but that doesn't, you know what I mean? Like, he still knew it was wrong. But the bigger part of his argument was he would say that he had 2 personalities. There was Ed, and then there was like this darker personality. And when the darker personality would take over, it would almost be like blacking out for him, and he wouldn't be able to control what he was going to do, and he would try to fight those urges, and he wouldn't be able to. After a 5-hour deliberation, the jury found him guilty on all 8 counts of murder. And because of this, on November 8th, 1973, he was given 7 years to life per victim. Now, Edmund actually requested the death penalty, and he wasn't given the death penalty. He was given 7 years to life per victim, served concurrently, which means he was eligible for parole after 7 years. He didn't get it, but he was first eligible for parole after 7 years. And he's been eligible for parole multiple times since then. He is still in prison till today. He's in prison now. And like, I don't know how to talk about stuff like this without making it sound like I'm admiring the serial killers, because I'm not. What he did was awful, and I in no way am condoning that. And it's awful that 8 women lost their lives. It's awful that he took the life of his mother. Doesn't matter how awful she was to him as a child. Her friend had nothing to do with it. He killed a 15-year-old little girl just wanting to get to dance class. A 15-year-old little girl who was kind enough and trustworthy enough to let him back into the car. What he did was awful. But he seems like he thrives when he's locked up. Obviously, when he's locked up and he's not murdering people, he thrives really well in imprisonment. He did the first go around when he was 15 years old. Like I said, the psychiatrist loved him. He got to help the psychiatrist and kind of act as an aide to the psychiatrist, and was trained on how to do psychiatric testing on the other inmates. The same kind of thing when he got locked up this go around. He became in charge of scheduling appointments with the inmates and their psychiatrists. He would record book readings on tape, and he did this for blind people. In his free time, he recorded audiobooks, and he recorded over 100 different audiobooks for blind people. over 5,000 hours of audiobooks. And he did this all the way up until he had a stroke in 2015. And after he had the stroke in 2015 and became disabled from it, he couldn't really do it anymore. But up until then, he just did that in his free time. He also got into ceramics, like really into ceramics, which is kind of weird. But like, he also is one of those people, he will give interviews freely. He will talk to people freely. And he does this because he says if there's anybody out there who's like him, who behaves like him, who acts like him, who thinks like him, he wants to get the word out to them and say, hey, you need to get help before it gets to the point where it got to with me. You need to talk to someone before it got to the point where it got to with me. Because by the time it got to where I was, I couldn't stop. And once I started, I couldn't stop. And I can't say he genuinely wants to help people because you don't really know people's intentions. And when I say he genuinely wants to help people, that makes it sound like I think he's a good person. And I don't think he's a good person. He's a very messed up person. But it seems like he at least on some level is trying to do good things. And now, like I said, he went up for parole the first time, and he's been up for parole several times since then. Now, obviously, every time it's either been denied or he has waived his right to a trial. He's just chosen not to try that time. And he will be eligible again for parole in 2024. I don't know if he'll get it. He's getting kind of old now, but I guess we'll just see. He might not even go. He doesn't go to every parole hearing. Sometimes he just chooses not to, and that's fine with me. You tell me what you think. You tell me what you think, because this is one I could talk about all day. All right, friends, thank you for hanging out with me and chatting with me today about Big Ed Kemper. If you've stuck around this long, we're friends now too. If this is your thing, hit that like and subscribe button, because I have a whole lot more I'd love to talk with you about. And I'd love to chat and catch up on all things creepy.
And I was destroying it.
Why did you actually kill the girls?
My frustration, my inability to communicate socially, sexually. I wasn't impotent, but emotionally I was impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships. I knew absolutely nothing about that whole area. Even if just sitting down and talking with a young lady. I need to be able to really communicate, and ironically enough, that's why I began picking people up. And I'm picking up young women, and I'm going a little bit farther each time. It's a daring kind of a thing. At first there wasn't a gun. I'm driving along. We go to a vulnerable place where there aren't people watching, where I could act out, and I say, no, I can't. And then a gun is in the car, hidden. And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. This fantastic passion. It was overwhelming me. It was like drugs. It was like alcohol. A little isn't enough. At first it is. And as you adjust to that, psychologically and physically, you take more and more and more. It's the same process. So it finally came down to the thing of, do I dare bring this gun out? Already realizing if that gun comes out, something has to happen. It was going to happen. I didn't see it then, but it was going to happen. I was playing a dangerous game with a loaded gun that got us all.